Let's dig in a little more about ETC specifically. You already alluded to this a little bit earlier. I completely echo the sentiment that the Casper Ethereum proof of stake switch is going to be a tremendous opportunity for Classic to inherit just a massive amount of that hash power. And quite frankly, I think very recently that hash power even surpassed the Bitcoin blockchain. I'm not positive that's right, but I think that's the case.
Yeah, but that's apples to oranges because they have different consensus algorithms.
Okay.
Kind of different.
All right. Fair. But you're planning some smart pool movement to kind of make more efficient use of that hash power?
Well, okay, so one of the foremost problems with mining is it's a very fragile system. What do I mean by that? It means that it tends to optimize around specialized actors. And even Satoshi knew this was going to happen. So he said, listen, you're going to have CPUs turn into GPUs, turn into FPGAs, turn into ASICs. And this is going to happen pretty quickly if there's money at stake because people like money. And then all of a sudden it's a race to the lowest cost of power. Who gets that? Subsidized power in developing countries like China. So people who have first access to the tech, first access to the algorithms, first access to the subsidized power are going to win the game. And it becomes eventually a small federated market. In fact, it was great at scaling Bitcoin in Hong Kong. There's this picture of all these miners together. And if you add up all their cumulative hash power, it's more than 51% of the network. You don't have a decentralized protocol when the guys who control the state transitions of your protocol can all be put in a single room. And it's supposed to be a global product. So while mining gives you some magical things that are really magical that proof of stake actually can't give you. For example, you have algorithmic weight with mining. So you basically, if you're a new guy comes into the blockchain, never seen it before, you don't trust anyone. You don't have any knowledge. You just run a calculation. Bob gives you chain A, Alice gives you chain B, Jane gives you chain C down the line, and you run a calculation of whatever chain you've gotten that has more work behind it, that's your chain. No checkpoints. I don't know of any other system that has that kind of property as elegant and concise as Bitcoin does. Very powerful, okay? But what we are paying right now is enormous cost of energy, and what we're paying right now is the ever-increasing amount of centralization around competency, subsidy, and first access to things. So what things like Smart Pool are trying to accomplish is saying you can have your cake and eat it too. What if you could create a decentralized mining pool? So say, does it really matter if we only have 10 or 20 actors, if the only way they can mine is through some channel that's peer-to-peer and decentralized? So we don't have these private pools or even federated pools that have operators. Instead, you have a decentralized pool. People mine with that decentralized pool, and the output is exactly the same. You get all the security of Bitcoin has, but now you can't have any one of the actors manipulate the behavior of the pool. So as a consequence, you've effectively defederated the federation in a certain sense. You're forcing them to play by certain rules. So this is an idea that Loy Liu out of Singapore and several other people came up with, and they wrote a lovely paper about it, and they've been implementing it in Solidity as a smart contract to show how one would do that. But I would advocate for a lot of research along these lines to find a way to actually put this into a proof of work protocol as a permanent feature that everybody's forced to use. Then you no longer have centralization. You have a way of maximizing decentralization of the system. A lot of things still have to be figured out, like dust transactions and a lot of these other little things. But the smart pool approach actually solved a lot of them. And I think that Loy has done a very good job, and I'm very proud of the hard work that they've done. I believe he's porting it to ETC, and we're certainly going to take a look at that. Now, the other side of it is the energy usage. The problem with cryptocurrencies that use proof of work is the energy usage never gets better. Because if the value goes up, the competition goes up, the amount of resources expended increase, and inevitably the energy usage increases. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year on electricity for Bitcoin. It's a fact. More than the nation of Ireland. There's a paper from McDowell that actually shows that Bitcoin consumes more electricity than Ireland consumes. So we're starting to get into like a serious consideration of that. You have this small network, all things considered, compared to Visa or global financial system, but yet it's already become a very energy intensive network. Now, the Bitcoin maximalists will say this is a feature, and it's one of the reasons why Bitcoin is so secure, and there's some truth there. But on the other hand, if you like the environment, it's probably not a good idea to endorse wasting enormous amounts of electricity. So there are two philosophies on how to solve this. One is to change your algorithm to something that doesn't require enormous sums of energy. So that's the proof of stake approach, amongst others. The other philosophy is to say, if we have to waste the energy, let's try to get something out of it other than just work. So that's called useful proof of work. And there's been a lot of ideas floating around about how one would do this. But the basic idea is you take some sort of problem and you find a way to take that problem and create a trap door with the problem that verifies that you've solved the problem. You've done the computations correctly. So you go from an O of n algorithm to a constant or logarithmic time algorithm. And there are some platforms that potentially could do this. One's called Pinocchio. It's from Microsoft Research. And they basically allow you to have an input and output program and a proof. You don't have to look at the program. You just look at the input, the output, and the proof. And it actually tells you if you actually ran the program correctly. And the proof is constant size. It's only 288 bits and evaluates O of 1. So it's a very promising platform. Unfortunately, it's still very inefficient. It has a lot of little bugs and issues that Microsoft and other people are working on to fix. There's also another great paper out of Berkeley, which talks about useful proof of work. So instead of doing proof of work problems on wasted electricity with hashing, finding reverse of a hash, there's like all these useful problems that if you solve them would be useful for real problems in computer science. And the paper actually enumerates them and shows how to construct a proof of work system based on it. Another way is actually saying, well, why don't we shift from proof of work to proof of storage? And then basically use a proof of work system to secure a decentralized database. So there's a great paper that was written by Ari Jules and a few others called Permacoin back in 2013. And Permacoin basically is an attempt to build a proof of work system on a database securing the database. So this is a line of research, and there's been a lot of future research that's being done, and I think there's a lot of promise there. So I think in the future, we have a lot of options. First, you can decentralize the mining process itself, either by disincentivizing the formation of pools, either by making it impossible to create a pool, or by using things like Smart Pool. And then on the energy consumption side, either you don't care or you care. If you care, you have to use a different protocol. If you do care, then maybe it's, if you don't care, but maybe it's a good idea to switch your proof of work to something that's at least more useful. So you're optimizing the resources that you spend in that respect. So that's kind of how I see the debate forming. And there's a lot of really good research that's starting to become prevalent. We're starting to see some good coins floating out that are derivatives of that research.
Interesting. Now, one of the things that China's been a very big driver for the ETC community, I believe. And on that same note, they're obviously the preeminent space in mining. So with you set to inherit so much of this mining hash power, was this planned, or just happened to be kind of a perfect storm for ETC?
We don't know. Maybe Ethereum will abandon their plan to go to proof of stake and just stay on proof of work, or maybe the Chinese miners will all get shut down, or maybe they'll all go and mine some other cryptocurrency. Miners tend to mine the things that are most profitable, not necessarily the things that are most philosophically agreeable to them. In the Satoshi days, we all had laptops and we could leave them on at night, and those were great. So you could be a philosopher. In the mining days, mining operations are businesses. And at the end of the day, it's cash in, cash out. So your mining operation has to be profitable. And so you can't exactly say, I'm going to mine cryptocurrency A because I love and agree with cryptocurrency A, unless cryptocurrency A produces enough money for you to keep lights on. So if B is more profitable, the rational decision for a miner is to pivot. It's not because they're assholes or bad people. It's just because of economics and the fact that you have a fiduciary obligation to your business to do what's best for your business. So that's always been one of the challenges with miners, is it's like this group of people that you're bribing to come into your ecosystem and do stuff for you, but they're mercenaries and by design. And so if somebody's paying more, the barbarians can turn on Rome and burn the city down. So you have to be really careful when you create incentive schemes that are very sensitive to your competitors, especially if your competitors can do bad things to you, which is why people are considering consensus algorithms that aren't even based on mining, but based on things like trusted hardware. Like there's ideas of like T-chain and using things like Intel SGX and ARM Trust Zone and TPMs to build kind of a namespace and give people control. Where now all of a sudden you've democratized the system now, and there's no cost to participation. So really you have a situation where people are going to participate because they believe in it, like folding at home or these other things, not because they built a business around it. And this is one of the core arguments for proof of stake as well, in that my financial interests are directly aligned with the survivability and value of the underlying network. I can't just point my miners to another chain and go play in that space if this chain starts failing. If I'm a proof of stake coin and my coins start going down in value, that's not good for me. And so I'm going to behave in a way that I'm always trying to maximize the overall value of the chain. So there's a lot of, good economic questions to ask there. But to answer your question in particular about, are we going to inherit the Chinese? We'll get some of them. We already have some. Chandler Guo, for example, and he's done a wonderful job. And there's some great people there. And we love getting more miners. It's an amazing thing. But the end all be all isn't mining. It's more about the totality of the community and what each actor in the community's incentives happen to be to grow the ecosystem and make the ecosystem more vibrant and robust.
Excellent. I mean, let's dive right in and let's talk a little bit more about that. Plans to obviously further penetrate the Chinese market, hosting ETC ICOs of your own, or in fact, you talked a lot about wanting to differentiate the Ethereum Classic chain more. So what are some more of those plans of differentiation? I know at one point that you were considering a proof of work, proof of stake hybrid for Ethereum Classic. So just kind of talk about the technical development roadmap, what you guys are considering, differentiators, and where all the big things we can expect from Ethereum Classic.
Yeah, so it's first important to understand that Ethereum Classic is a true federation. So I'm not in charge, and I don't want to be in charge, and that's good. It's very good for our ecosystem. So there are my opinions, and then there's the community. And no matter what I believe, it has to be enshrined in an ECIP, an Ethereum Classic Improvement Proposal. And we have to go fight and convince people that it's a good idea. And there's a hell of a lot of people on the other side that probably won't think it's a good idea. And that's good for the community because it means that eventually you get down to that crucible of goodness. So there's also ETC dev. Now, where do we have consensus? We have consensus on proof of work probably being the path forward. What instantiation of proof of work, whether it should be useful or a hybrid, or we should change Ghost to something else and add Spectre. There's a lot of open questions there, and these things are going to be fought over the next 24 months. In my view, I think it's a really good idea to institute a hybrid consensus algorithm. In particular, we created one called Twins Coins with Hong Chang out of Virginia Commonwealth University. So what is it? Well, it's basically a consensus algorithm that creates a checks and balances system where a miner will find a block, which in turn elects a delegate from the stakeholder set, and that stakeholder finishes the block, and only then and then when these two have come together do you advance the network. And let's say the stakeholder doesn't do their job, people are still mining, another block will be found, another stakeholder is elected. So you have this lovely competitiveness, and we created a mathematical model that showed that not only does it work, and we should have liveness according to GKL 15, that you get much higher resistance against selfish mining and miners who collude and so forth, because you have this checks and balances that's built in, but you have none of the problems of proof of stake. You don't have long range attacks, you don't have grinding attacks, you don't have nothing at stake attacks and so forth. So all that stuff is out the window. So it's a really nice compromise where you're mostly still mining, but then you also have this added layer of security, which I think is a really productive way of getting people engaged. For free, you also get a voting system, because now you have all these POS mechanics. You can then overlay systems to start making decisions about, let's say, maybe a treasury, maybe a forking protocol to change the protocol to a new configuration and so forth, kind of like a Tezos style play. So I think that's a line of research that's really good. And we're going to eventually write an ECIP once our client, Growth and Deek, is done for how one would transition to a hybrid consensus algorithm. Then there are some open questions about the blockchain architecture. For example, what authenticated data structures should be in this thing. We have Merkle-Patricia tries and Ethereum, Bitcoin is Merkle trees, but there are actually others. We created an authenticated dictionary paper that's quite good with Leo Raisin out of Boston University. But there's all these kinds of authenticated data structures that you can put into your block header that give you some more features, richness, and functionality, and perhaps better light client support. And there's some really good ideas that are starting to brew up there. So there needs to be some questions about that. And there needs to be some questions about whether should we continue being this very crude directed acyclic graph by a Ghost, or should we abandon Ghost altogether, or go with a better version of it, because there's been now 4 years of good research post-Ghost for that scheme. So there's going to be some discussions around blockchain architecture, authenticated data structures, and so forth. And eventually we'll come up, I think, with a reasonable community conclusion of either to stay the course or to pivot a little bit or pivot a lot. And I think a lot of that has to do with whatever our scalability proposal happens to be. Then the other thing is, how much decentralization do we want to have on the mining process? And do we want to change the underlying mining algorithm to either be ASIC resistant or to be more decentralized, like put smart poll into the protocol itself and so forth? But I think that's probably more of a 2019 fight or late 2018 fight. There's just a lot of things in front of that to figure out. Now, in terms of other technology, there still is an open question of how will we pay for things. So you mentioned ICOs. And this is one of my problems, actually, with the Ethereum model right now. You got a lot of people really rich really quickly, and they think they can't lose. You know, you have to understand something. When you get 100x or 1000x in a very short period of time, you're not smart. You're lucky. And the biggest moral hazard in the world is when you don't know the difference between being smart and being lucky. Okay? Maybe, just maybe, you're a brilliant chemist, you came up with some new drug, and you know this drug is going to work, and you get FDA approval. Congratulations. That's 1 in a million. But when you get 1 million people buy something and they all get 100x or 1000x, they just got lucky on it. So because people have gotten lucky, they have a lot of loose money. And so you have all these ICOs that are forming on Ethereum now, which in my view have dubious strategies. They don't really fully appreciate the complexity of what they're trying to do, or in some cases are totally unnecessary to have their own token. Just use Ether, that are launching and raising 10 million, 20 million, 30 million. And the offerings are just weird, like in 30 seconds to get $35 million, and people are spending $2,000 on a transaction fee just to front run everybody else so that they can get in. Or you have something like a 94% pre-mine, a $300 million market cap, and you know, that's somehow a fair offering. It's just nuts. So I think that in many respects, the ICO model does prey upon irrational exuberance, and it tends to lead to bad outcomes in the long term. But it is a very powerful model because it democratizes the raising of capital, and it democratizes the funding of good ideas, and gives people in bad jurisdictions access to money they would have never been able to get. If you live in Africa, and let's say South Africa, you go to a great university there, and you're a brilliant person, you have an amazing idea, you're not going to be able to go and get money out of Silicon Valley or out of Europe. Just won't. That's just the way the world works. Especially true if you're in a real bad jurisdiction like Venezuela, where everything's falling apart. So what does that person do when that person wants to raise money? They don't. Now they have a new model where they actually conceivably do that. So I think that there's both a good side and a bad side. I don't completely subscribe to this Chris DeRose, everything is, or Tone Vays view where like everything is a scam, these all guys are crooks. I think a lot of them really do want to do something great. It's just they don't fully appreciate what responsibilities they're taking on, the fact that they now have a social contract and a relationship with people, and also that that getting too much money too quickly can just be as hazardous as not having enough money to execute. Now, what does this have to do with Ethereum Classic? Now that Ethereum Classic is worth quite a bit of money, people are probably going to start running ICOs on Ethereum Classic. Because guess what? Our people got a 10x, 15x. Now there's a lot of loose money floating around Ethereum Classic. Somebody's going to get it in their head that it's a good idea to launch an app coin, and they probably will get well funded as a consequence of that. Doesn't mean it'll succeed or fail. It's a scam or not a scam. It's just the reality of nature. How I would like to see Ethereum Classic funded is via a treasury. I think the time has come for that. There's some great evidence that treasuries are good, from PIVX to Dash to Zen to others who are actively trying to find a way to have the blockchain pay the bills. We're one of the few companies in space that's actually rigorously pursuing it. We have a team at Lancaster University doing coercion-resistant liquid democracy and adding it to a treasury model that we constructed with our Veritas team in Ukraine. And then after that, we're going to have that game theorist come in and clean all up the model. And after that, we think we'll have a really good reference treasury model. And we're going to fight like hell to try to convince people in ETC that this is a potentially really good idea. And also, it makes the system more vibrant and robust, because now, unlike Ethereum, where the only way you can get money to build your dApp is to create a token which you may or may not need and go do an ICO or take VC money, but if it's an open source project and you're running it with no toll road to give yourself a cut, well then what's the VC's angle? There's no rational way to fund that. Now you can actually send a ballot to a treasury. and the Treasury can fund you, and you get your $500,000, your $1 million to go build that infrastructure. So that's a competitive advantage in my view, and I think it's something that would make us very different from ETH in the way the community works. The other thing is that you have the synergistic effect of people talking to each other, which is so powerful. Going way back to the beginning of the interview where I was talking about idea flow, one of the reasons why Dash has grown so much, whether you love them or you hate them, is they have these ballots and people can talk about what to fund and what not to fund. And they're always going about what is our mission, what are our goals, why are we doing what we're doing, who's worth money, who's not worth money to fund. So similarly, if you had an open process for that, you can really start having some serious discussions about what core infrastructure ought to be deployed on your platform. For example, what if Loy Lu comes and says, I want to deploy Smart Pool on Ethereum Classic. And at the same time, some guy, let's call him Bob, comes and says, I want to build a relay system so Ethereum Classic can now talk to Ethereum. And you can call Ethereum contracts on Ethereum Classic. These are great projects. And then let's say you can only fund one. How would you reach that? Well, if you had a treasury system, there'd be a formal process. They'd both propose ballots, and now they're fighting each other. And there's an intellectual discussion about priorities. There's a discussion about what's going to create the most value for the community. There's a discussion about who do we think is going to be best to execute. And each side has an incentive to make the case for themselves. With ICOs, the incentive is, do I think this is going to make me a good return? Not necessarily are they actually going to deliver the product. Not necessarily are they the best team to deliver the product. It's more a macroeconomic circumstance of, well, everything's going way up and I've already made 100x, so I'll put some money into this and hope I get another 10 or 20x. That's a very different mindset, and it has nothing to do with about what is best for the ecosystem, what is best for the project. You're not differentiating anything. It's all just about ROI and many of these ICOs that are occurring. So I think it's a dangerous model from that angle. That said, it's a great model for people in countries that don't have access to capital, and it's an alternative way of doing things. I will add one other caveat to ICOs. One thing that does disturb me is that in ICOs, people aren't doing KYC and AML. And I know the more libertarian people say, like, you don't have the right. But, you know, the reality is that when you offer something, you are taking another human being's money, okay? You have to know who those people are. Whether they be investors, donors, customers, you have to know who they are, because when bad things happen, you have to know who to talk to. And you have to know who to say, I'm sorry to. You have to know who to put in consumer protection for. I'm very old-fashioned in that respect, but I believe when you have a business, and you have to have relationships with your customers, and you have to inform them, you have to treat them fairly, and you have to work hard to be in their best benefit. You're not always going to be perfect. You're not always going to be completely accurate. You're not always going to execute as well as you should. But one of the things that does bother me is that all these ICOs are raising huge sums of money, and they're not doing KYC AML. There's a philosophical problem, as I just mentioned, but there's also a practical problem. So if somebody does an ICO and the inventory all sells out in 15 minutes, how do you know that the founders of the project didn't put in 50% of the float? If you've been in the space long enough, remember Next, when they had that little crowd sale, and it was very small, very selective, and they closed it very early. Probably not a lot of, the Gini coefficient was probably pretty bad there, okay? So what does this mean? It means that any value appreciation you have may be utilized by the very early people, the founders, to make a windfall profit and have nothing at all to do with whether they've actually executed the project or not. And it's not transparent. You don't even know. Because I can just, if I'm an investor in an ICO, just chop my offering into 25 transactions or 500 transactions and make it look like it's 500 people. If you do KYC and AML, that's not possible, because you got the guy's passport, you got his proof of address, you got his number. So you know it's one person or 500 people and so forth. So at least you have an added layer of protection there. And I think that's actually better for the investor in a certain respect, because you know it's an organic participation. You know what the average transaction size is. You know who owns what, and there's much lower possibility of a pump and dump in that particular respect. So that's a personal pet peeve of mine. I think there's also going to be some regulatory problems for people with ICOs, namely because let's say it's not a security. Well, what if you're a money service business? Yeah, you now have to do that KYC AML. And if you didn't do that, that's not just a fine, it's jail time. There was a Bitcoin trader actually in the United States who was selling stuff on local Bitcoins, and he was running an unregistered money service business. I think he got 9 years in jail. So who's to say that a token issuer is not an MSB? I mean, if you really think about it, it's like, oh, we're decentralized and everything. Well, hang on a second here. Is there a team? Is there a legal entity? Or Does the team have access to the funds, or the legal entity have access to the funds? It seems pretty centralized if all the money is coming into one pie.